They say the Wyoming wind in 1887 didn't just chill your bones, it whispered your secrets. For Sarah Miller, a widow left with nothing but a failing homestead and a mountain of debt the wind whispered of failure. She was one day away from losing everything. But then a knock came at the door that changed history. It wasn't the bank, and it wasn't the sheriff. It was a stranger with a dark past, a gun on his hip, and a secret hiding behind his long coat that would turn the entire territory upside down. This isn't just a romance. It's a story of survival betrayal and the lies we tell to protect the ones we love. This is the story of the lonely rancher. The relentless wind of the Bighorn Basin didn't howl. It screamed. It battered the timber walls of the Miller homestead, searching for cracks for weakness. Inside, Sarah Miller sat at the rough-hewn oak table, her head in her hands. The ledger before her was open, but she didn't need to look at the numbers to know the truth. The ink was red, and the future was black. It had been 6 months since Jacob died. 6 months since the accident at the sawmill that the sheriff called a tragic mishap, and the town whispers called something else. Since then, the cattle had thinned, the fences had fallen, and the vultures' men like Jedediah Rourke had started circling. Sarah stood up the floorboards, groaning under her worn boots. She walked to the window, staring out into the grey twilight. The snow was beginning to fall, dusting the sagebrush in white. She was 32 years old, but tonight she felt 80. She reached for the heavy iron skillet to start supper, a meager stew of potatoes and dried beef, when the sound came. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, deliberate knock. Sarah froze. No one came out this far past Silver Creek, especially not with a storm brewing. Instinct, sharpened by months of living alone on the frontier, took over. She didn't reach for the door handle. She reached for the Winchester rifle hanging above the hearth. She checked the chamber loaded and leveled it at the door. "Who is it?" she called out. Her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Just a traveler, ma'am. Looking for work." The voice was deep, gravelly, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "I have no money for hands," Sarah shouted back. "Keep moving." "I don't need money." The voice returned calm and unhurried. "And I ain't alone." That gave her pause. A bandit wouldn't announce company. Curiosity warring with fear made her lower the rifle slightly. She unlatched the heavy deadbolt and cracked the door open, keeping the barrel pointed at the gap. A man stood on her porch. He was tall, his hat pulled low, water dripping from the brim onto a canvas duster that had seen better decades, let alone days. His face was a map of hard, living stubble, darkening a square jaw, eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He looked dangerous. He looked like the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about in church whispers. But then he shifted his weight, and Sarah saw it. A small hand clutching the fabric of his duster. The man stepped aside slightly, revealing a little girl tucked behind his leg. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She wore a woolen coat that was 2 sizes too big, and a bonnet that obscured her face, but Sarah could see she was shivering violently. The man looked Sarah in the eye, removing his hat to reveal messy dark hair. "I was told you need a rancher," he said, the phrase heavy with specific intent. Sarah looked at the gun on his hip, a Colt Peacemaker with a worn walnut grip, and then down at the child. The girl looked up, her eyes wide, and terrified, her lips blue from the cold. The mothering instinct that Sarah had never been able to use, she and Jacob had tried for years with no luck, surged through her chest, overriding her caution. "Get in," Sarah said, stepping back and lowering the rifle fully. "Before you freeze the child to death." The man nodded a sharp, military-like motion and ushered the girl inside. He closed the door against the wind, shutting out the howling world. "I'm Silas," he said, not offering a hand, just the name. "Silas Mercer. This is Lily." "Sarah Miller," she replied, watching him carefully. "You said you were told I needed a rancher. Who told you?" Silas hesitated. For a split second, a shadow passed over his eyes' wilt grief. She couldn't tell. "Folks in town talk. Heard the widow Miller was struggling to keep the place standing. I'm good with cattle. Better with horses. I'll work for room and board for me and the girl." Sarah scoffed, walking back to the stove. "I can't feed 2 more mouths, Mr. Mercer. I can barely feed myself. The bank is coming for this place in 30 days if I don't come up with $200. Silas looked around the cabin. He noted the draft coming from the window frame, the unwashed dishes the rifle she kept too close. "I can fix the draft in the barn loft. We'll sleep there. We won't be a burden." "Why?" Sarah challenged, turning to face him. "Why would a man like you fit strong work for nothing but a hayloft in a blizzard?" Silas looked down at Lily, who was staring at the fire, mesmerized by the heat. He placed a large, calloused hand on the girl's shoulder. The tenderness of the gesture seemed at odds with the violence written on his face. "Because," Silas said softly, "we have nowhere else to go, and I reckon you need a man who isn't afraid of Jed Rourke." The name hung in the air like smoke. Sarah stiffened. "What do you know about Rourke?" "I know he's the one squeezing you," Silas said. "And I know men like him don't stop until they take everything." Sarah looked at the girl again. Lily hadn't said a word. She just stood there clutching a ragged doll. "One night," Sarah said finally. "You can stay in the barn tonight. There are blankets in the chest by the door. But if I find anything missing in the morning, or if you come near this house without asking, I'll shoot you where you stand, Mr. Mercer, and I don't miss." Silas gave a rare, faint smirk. "I believe you, ma'am." He took the blankets and guided the girl toward the door. Just before he left, he turned. "Lock the bolt behind me. Rourke's men are riding the perimeter. I saw their tracks." He vanished into the snow, leaving Sarah alone in the silence. She rushed to the door, throwing the deadbolt and leaning her forehead against the wood. Her heart was racing. She had let a wolf into her fold, hoping he would fight off the other wolves. But as she looked at the empty spot where the little girl had stood, she wondered if Silas Mercer was a savior or the final nail in her coffin. The morning sun over the Wyoming plains was deceptive. It shone bright gold, illuminating the endless expanse of snow, but the air remained biting cold. Sarah woke with a start, her hand instantly going to the revolver she had tucked under her pillow. Silence. No sound of theft. No sound of horses galloping away. She threw off her quilt, dressed quickly in her heavy wool skirt and work coat, and moved to the window. Her breath caught in her throat. The front fence, which had been listing at a 45-degree angle for 3 months, was straight. Fresh posts had been driven into the frozen earth. A stack of firewood, neatly split, sat piled high against the porch railing, enough for a week. He hadn't left. Sarah grabbed her coat and walked out toward the barn. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. As she pushed open the large barn doors, she saw them. Lily was sitting on a bale of hay, holding a tin cup of steaming milk. A barn cat was curled up next to her, and for the first time, the child looked at peace. Silas was in the horse stall, brushing down Sarah's only remaining mare, a skittish chestnut named Bess. Bess usually bit anyone who wasn't Sarah. But under Silas's hands, the horse was calm, leaning into his touch. "She has a loose shoe," Silas said without turning around. "I re-shod her. Found some old iron in the back." Sarah stood in the doorway, crossing her arms. "You don't waste time." "Time's the only thing you can't get back," he muttered. He walked out of the stall, wiping his hands on a rag. "Checked your herd. You got 40 head left. They're skinny, but they'll survive the winter if we move them to the south pasture, where the windbreak is." "We—" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You can't move them alone. Silas stated flatly. Before Sarah could argue, the sound of galloping horses thundered up the drive. The peace of the morning shattered. Lily dropped her cup, the milk spilling into the straw, and scrambled backward, hiding behind the hay bales. Silas's demeanor changed instantly. The ranch hand vanished. The gunman appeared. His posture straightened, his hand drifting inches from his hip. "Stay inside," he ordered Sarah. "It's my ranch," she snapped, stepping out of the barn. 3 riders pulled up in a cloud of snow and dust. The lead rider sat on a massive black stallion. He wore a fine suit that looked out of place in the muck and a silver belly hat that cost more than Sarah's entire house. Jedediah Rourke, the man who owned half the valley and wanted the rest. "Morning, Widow Miller," Rourke shouted, his voice booming with false cheer. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from cold tallow, pale and greasy. "I see you survived the storm." "No thanks to you, Jed," Sarah said, standing her ground. "What do you want?" Rourke leaned forward on his saddle horn, his leather gloves creaking. Now, just being neighborly. I came to see if you've reconsidered my offer. $200 for the deed. It's generous, Sarah. More than this dust bowl is worth." "I told you," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly with anger. "This land isn't for sale. It was Jacob's dream." "Jacob is dead," Rourke said coldly, "and you're going to starve out here. I'm trying to save you." He signaled to one of his men, a brutish man with a scar across his nose named Vance. Wait, no, named Bull. "Maybe we should help Mrs. Miller pack. She seems confused." Bull dismounted, grinning. He took a step toward the porch. "That's far enough," a voice cut through the air. Rourke and his men snapped their heads toward the barn. Silas Mercer stepped out into the sunlight. He walked slowly, casually, but there was a coiled tension in his frame that made the horses nervous. Rourke narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "The new ranch manager," Silas lied smoothly. "And you're trespassing." Rourke laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Manager." "She can't pay you with nothing but dirt and tears, Drifter. Walk away before you get hurt." "I said." Silas stopped 10 feet from Rourke's horse, his hand hovering over his colt. "You're trespassing." Bull, the man on the ground, sneered and reached for his own gun. It happened so fast, Sarah barely saw it. Silas drew. He didn't fire, but the speed of the motion was a blur. In a heartbeat, the barrel of his peacemaker was leveled directly at Rourke's chest. "Tell your dog to heel," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, "or you ride home without him." The silence that followed was deafening. Rourke stared at Silas, analyzing him. He saw the way Silas held the weapon, unwavering, professional. This wasn't a cowboy. This was a killer. Rourke raised a hand, stopping Bull. "Easy," Rourke said. He looked at Silas with a newfound calculation. "You've got spirit, stranger. I like that. But you're betting on a losing horse." Rourke turned his gaze back to Sarah. "You hired a gunman." "That's an escalation, Sarah. Accidents happen when tensions run high. Remember the sawmill." The threat hit Sarah like a physical blow. She went pale. "Get off my land," she whispered. Rourke tipped his hat. 30 days, Sarah. Then the bank takes it and I buy it for pennies." He looked at Silas one last time. "Watch your back, friend. This valley eats strangers." Rourke wheeled his horse around and galloped off his men, trailing behind. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her knees buckling slightly. Silas holstered his gun in one fluid motion and turned to her. "He killed him," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He just admitted it. Remember the sawmill? He killed Jacob." Silas watched the dust settle on the horizon. His jaw was tight. "Yeah, he did." Sarah looked at him sharply. "How do you know you just got here?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked back toward the barn where Lily was hiding. "Men like Rourke don't make idle threats." "That's not what I asked," Sarah pressed, stepping closer to him. You handled that gun like you've done it 1,000 times. Who are you, Silas, really?" Silas looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm the man who's going to help you keep this ranch, Mrs. Miller. Now, are we moving those cattle, or are we talking—" Sarah wanted to push him. She wanted to demand answers. Why did he care? Why did he bring a child into a war zone? But as she looked at his back as he walked toward the pasture, she realized something. For the first time since Jacob died, she wasn't afraid of the night coming. She had a protector, but as Silas worked in the field that afternoon, Sarah noticed something else. She was watching him from the kitchen window while drying a plate. Silas had taken off his heavy coat to swing a sledgehammer against a fence post. On his forearm, revealed by his rolled-up sleeve, was a tattoo. It was faded black ink, a distinct symbol, 2 crossed sabers over a skull. Sarah dropped the plate. It shattered on the floor. She knew that symbol. She had seen it in Jacob's old war journals. It was the insignia of the 7th Cavalry's Shadow Unit, a unit that didn't officially exist, a unit that Jacob had sworn he left behind. Jacob hadn't just been a carpenter, and Silas wasn't just a rancher. Silas Mercer knew her husband, and he hadn't come here by accident. The shattered plate lay on the floorboards like a broken promise. Sarah didn't move to clean it up. Her eyes were fixed on the door through which Silas had just exited the image of that black ink tattoo. The crossed sabers and the skull burned into her mind. It wasn't just a military tattoo. It was a brand of the damned. Jacob had told her once in the dead of night when the nightmares woke him that the unit didn't have a name. They were the ghosts. They did the things the U.S. Army didn't want written in the history books. Sarah grabbed her shawl, ignoring the biting cold, and marched out to the barn. She found Silas in the loft, hammering a piece of siding to seal a draft. Lily was asleep on a pile of blankets, nearby the rhythmic thud of the hammer, acting as a strange lullaby. "Stop!" Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Silas paused the hammer mid-swing. He didn't look down at her. He just held the pose, his muscles tense under his shirt. "Draft ain't fixed yet, ma'am." "I don't care about the draft," Sarah hissed, climbing the ladder until she was eye level with him. "I care about the lie. You knew him. You knew Jacob." Silas slowly lowered the hammer. He turned to face her, wiping sweat from his brow. The shadows of the loft hid his eyes, but the set of his jaw was hard as granite. "I never said I didn't. You said you heard a widow needed help. You acted like a stranger." Sarah accused, stepping onto the loft floor. "But you have the mark, the ghosts. You served with him." Silas studied a heavy, weary sound. He walked over to a bale of hay and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. "I served with him, Sarah, for 3 years. We rode through the Dakotas down into Mexico. He was the best man I ever knew." "Then why didn't you come to the funeral?" Sarah's voice cracked. "If you were his friend, where were you when I buried him? Where were you when Rourke started circling?" "I was in prison," Silas said quietly. The confession hung in the cold air. Sarah stiffened. "Fort Leavenworth." Silas continued staring at his hands. "Military hold, for doing what I was ordered to do, but what the brass decided was a crime later on. I got out 2 weeks ago. I went to find Jacob. I thought he could help me start over. Help me and the girl." He looked up at Sarah, his grey eyes raw with pain. "When I got to town, I heard he was dead, and I heard how he died. A sawmill accident. Jacob Miller could build a cathedral with a pocket knife. He didn't slip into a blade, Sarah. He was murdered." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She had always suspected it, always felt it in her gut, but hearing it said aloud made it real. "Rourke wanted the water rights," she whispered. "Jacob wouldn't sell." "And now Rourke wants you gone so he can take it all," Silas said. "I couldn't save Jacob. I was locked in a cage. But I'm here now, and I ain't leaving until this debt is paid." Sarah looked at the sleeping child. "And Lily? Who is she?" Silas's expression softened, the hard lines of his face melting into something profound and sad. "She's not mine. Not by blood. Her daddy was in the unit too. He didn't make it back from Mexico. Her mother died of the fever last winter. I promised him. I promised I'd look out for her." Sarah felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of shame for her suspicion. This man was a collection of broken promises and heavy burdens just like her. He was carrying a dead friend's child and fighting a dead friend's war. "Supper is in 10 minutes, Sarah said softly, her anger dissipating. "Bring the girl inside. It's too cold for her out here." Silas nodded a silent thanks, passing between them. That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. It wasn't warm exactly, but the icy wall of distrust had cracked. They ate in silence, the only sound the clinking of spoons and the howling wind. Suddenly, Lily spoke. "The wind is angry," she whispered. Her voice was tiny, raspy from disuse. Sarah looked up surprised. It was the first time she had heard the child speak. "It's just the winter, sweetie. It passes." Lily shook her head solemnly. "No. The bad men make the wind angry." Sarah looked at Silas. He was staring at the window, his knife gripped tight in his hand. "She has a sense for things," Silas murmured. "She knows when trouble is coming." As if on cue, a loud crack echoed from outside, the sound of wood snapping under immense pressure. Silas was out of his chair before the sound faded the Colt in his hand. "Stay here," he ordered, blowing out the oil lamp to plunge the room into darkness. He slipped out the door. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, peering through the frost. In the moonlight, she saw the silhouette of the water tower, the lifeline of the ranch. It was leaning dangerously. A rope had been thrown over the main support beam, attached to a saddle horn of a rider in the distance. They were trying to pull the tower down to crush the well pump. Without water, the cattle would die in days. "Hey!" Silas's roar echoed across the yard. He didn't fire a warning shot. He fired at the rope. The bullet severed the taut hemp with a snap, sending the rider's horse stumbling forward from the sudden loss of tension. The rider recovered, wheeling his horse around. 2 other shadows emerged from the tree line. Rourke's men. Sarah saw muzzle flashes from the dark. Bullets thudded into the logs of the cabin. She ducked, shielding Lily with her body. Outside, Silas didn't retreat. He moved. He was a shadow in the snow, sprinting from the porch to the cover of the woodpile. He fired bang-bang, measured calm shots. One rider yelped, clutching his arm, and turned his horse to flee. The other 2 hesitated. Silas Mercer wasn't a rancher defending a home. He was a soldier clearing a field. He advanced on them, walking steadily, while firing, suppressing them with sheer aggression. Panic took them. The hired guns, realizing they weren't paid enough to die in the snow, spurred their horses and scattered into the night. Silas stood in the yard for a long moment, scanning the horizon. Then he holstered his gun and walked back to the water tower, inspecting the damage. When he came back inside, Sarah lit the lamp. Silas was bleeding. A bullet had grazed his cheek, leaving a nasty gash. "Sit," Sarah ordered, pointing to the chair. Silas sat, adrenaline fading, leaving him looking exhausted. Sarah fetched a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. She stepped between his spread knees, gently wiping the blood from his face. For a moment, the war outside didn't exist. There was only the heat of the stove, the smell of iron and soap, and the proximity of their bodies. Silas looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. Sarah felt a pull, a magnetic draw to this dangerous, broken man who was bleeding for her land. She traced the line of the cut on his cheekbone. His hand came up, hovering as if to touch her waist, then stopped. He pulled back, remembering who she was. Jacob's wife. "They'll be back," Silas said, his voice rough. "Rourke won't stop with the water tower. He's testing our defenses." "Let them come," Sarah said, surprised by her own ferocity. She pulled the bandage tight. "We aren't leaving Silas." "We," he repeated. The word hung there, heavy with implication. "No, we aren't." 3 days passed. The tension in the valley was like a violin string wound too tight, ready to snap. The snow had paused, leaving the world a blinding white. Sarah knew they needed supplies. The shootout had depleted their ammunition, and the flour barrel was scraping bottom. Going to town was a risk, but staying isolated was a death sentence. They needed to show the town that the Miller Ranch was still standing. "We go together," Silas said, harnessing Bess to the buckboard wagon. He had cleaned his duster, and though his clothes were worn, he wore them with a dignity that made him look like a king in exile. Sarah wore her best Sunday dress, a dark blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, though she hid her rifle under the blanket at her feet. Lily sat between them, wrapped in a quilt, her eyes darting nervously at the trees. The ride to Silver Creek was tense. Every rustle of the brush, every distant bird call felt like an ambush. When they rolled into the main street, the town went quiet. Silver Creek was a typical frontier town, a muddy thoroughfare lined with false front buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and 3 saloons. As Silas guided the wagon to the hitching post in front of the general store, eyes followed them. Folks stopped sweeping their porches. Men stopped talking. They were a spectacle. The widow and the drifter. The scandal was written on every face. Sarah held her head high, climbing down from the wagon. Silas lifted Lily down, setting her gently on the boardwalk. "Ignore them," Silas muttered to Sarah. "They're sheep. Rourke is the wolf." They entered the general store. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the gloom inside. Mr. Henderson, the shopkeep, was behind the counter. He was a kind man usually, but today he wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, placing her list on the counter. "I need flour, coffee, 50 rounds of 45 Colt, and a tin of peppermint for the girl." Henderson shifted uncomfortably, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mrs. Miller, I can't fill this order." Sarah frowned. "Why not I see the sacks right there?" "It ain't about stock, Sarah," Henderson said quietly, glancing at the door. "It's about credit. Your account is frozen. The bank sent word this morning. Said your assets are under review for foreclosure." "That's illegal." Sarah slammed her hand on the counter. "I have 30 days. I'm sorry, Sarah. Truly. But if I sell to you on credit Rourke, well, he supplies my freight. He'll cut me off." The bell jingled again. The air in the store turned instantly stale. Jedediah Rourke walked in flanked by the sheriff, a man named Grady, who had a spine made of jelly. Rourke was dressed immaculately in a charcoal suit, a gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. "Shopping Mrs. Miller?" Rourke asked, his voice dripping with faux politeness. "I heard you were having cash flow problems." "Shame." Silas stepped out from the shadows of the aisle, positioning himself between Sarah and Rourke. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a looming wall of violence. Rourke smirked. "Ah, the watchdog. Silas isn't it, Sheriff? This is the man who shot at my employees the other night. Attempted murder." Sheriff Grady cleared his throat, looking nervous. "Now, Jed, they said they were trespassing. They were fixing a fence." Rourke lied smoothly. "And this maniac opened fire." Rourke turned his cold eyes to Sarah. "You're keeping dangerous company, Sarah. A widow living with a man with a criminal record at Leavenworth. People are talking. They say you've disrespected Jacob's memory. They say you're a—" "Say it," Silas said. His voice was a low growl. "Finish that sentence, Rourke, and I'll cut your tongue out right here." The threat was so visceral, so genuine, that Rourke actually took a step back. "You see," Rourke gestured to the shopkeep, "a violent animal." He looked at Sarah with mock pity. "I'm doubling my offer, Sarah, only because I pity you. Take the money. Leave town with your lover before the law has to step in." Sarah stepped around Silas. She was trembling not with fear, but with rage. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wedding ring. It was a simple gold band, the only thing of value she owned. She slammed it onto the counter. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Weigh it. It's solid gold. That covers the flour and the bullets." Henderson looked at the ring, then at Sarah's fierce eyes. He nodded slowly. "It does, ma'am. And then some." "Keep the change," Sarah said. She grabbed the sack of flour herself. "Let's go, Silas." They walked out, leaving Rourke standing there, his jaw clenched. Sarah had publicly defied him. She had sold her marriage to save the land. It was a victory, but it felt like an amputation. The ride back was silent. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. "You didn't have to do that," Silas said softly as they neared the ranch entrance. "Yes, I did," Sarah replied, staring straight ahead. "Jacob is gone. The ring is just metal. The land is the promise." As they crested the final hill, the smell hit them first. Acrid. Thick. Then Lily screamed, "Fire!" Down in the valley, the barn was glowing, not with the warmth of a lantern, but with the inferno of destruction. Flames were licking up the sides of the timber, reaching for the roof. "Bess!" Silas yelled. The horses were inside. He whipped the reins, sending the wagon careening down the muddy slope. They skidded to a halt in the yard. The heat was intense, melting the snow into a muddy slurry. "Stay with the girl!" Silas roared, leaping from the wagon. "No!" Sarah yelled, grabbing a bucket from the well. Silas didn't argue. He kicked open the barn door. Smoke billowed out, black and choking. The horses were screaming, thrashing in their stalls. The fire had started in the hayloft arson. Silas disappeared into the smoke. Sarah ran to the trough, filling the bucket, throwing water onto the flames, eating the doorframe. It was useless. The fire was too big. "Silas!" she screamed. A moment later, Bess burst through the smoke, her eyes wild with terror. Silas was holding her halter, dragging her out, coughing violently. He slapped the horse's flank, sending her running toward the pasture. "There's two more!" Silas yelled, turning back. "The roof is going to collapse!" Sarah grabbed his arm, the heat blistering her skin. "Let them go, Silas. It's too late. It's all you have," Silas shouted back. His face streaked with soot and sweat. He pulled away from her and dove back into the inferno. Sarah stood there, helpless, the roar of the fire drowning out her heartbeat. Seconds stretched into minutes. The main beam of the roof groaned a terrible cracking sound. Crash! The roof caved in, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. "Silas!" Sarah screamed, falling to her knees in the mud. Silence followed, save for the crackling of the timber. Then a shape emerged from the back of the collapsed structure through the side door that had been blown open. Silas stumbled out, leading the last steer. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, his duster smoking. Sarah scrambled over to him. He was alive. He was burned, his eyebrows singed off, his hands blistered, but he was alive. She grabbed him, hugging him fiercely, burying her face in his smoky shoulder. "You idiot!" she sobbed. "You idiot!" Silas coughed, spitting black phlegm. He looked up at the burning ruins of the barn. The winter feed was gone. The tack was gone. "They're escalating," Silas rasped. "This wasn't just a warning, Sarah. This was a siege." Sarah looked at the fire, the reflection dancing in her tear-filled eyes. Rourke had taken her ring, and now he had taken her barn. "He wants a war," Sarah whispered, her voice hardening into something cold and deadly. "Then let's give him one." She looked at Silas, then at Lily, who was watching from the wagon clutching her doll. "Take the girl inside," Sarah said. "Clean your guns, Mr. Mercer. Tomorrow we stop defending. Tomorrow we hunt." The smell of wet ash was a shroud that draped over the ranch for 2 days. The barn was gone, reduced to a blackened skeleton of charred timber and twisted iron. But in the ashes, something in Sarah Miller had hardened. The fear that had defined her existence since Jacob's death had evaporated in the heat of the fire, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. They were in the cabin, the windows boarded up with scrap wood to prevent sniper fire. The table was covered not with ledgers of debt, but with maps. Silas was cleaning his weapons, the Colt Peacemaker, a Winchester 1873 lever action, and a jagged Bowie knife that looked like it had seen too many fights in Mexico. "We can't outgun them," Silas said, his voice low. He was running an oil rag over the rifle barrel. "Rourke has 20 men on payroll. Maybe more if he calls in favors from the Cattle Association. If we stand here and wait for them to ride up, we die." Sarah stood by the stove, melting lead scraps into a mold to cast bullets. Her hands were steady. "You said we hunt. What are we hunting?" "Information," Silas replied. He looked up, his grey eyes catching the lantern light. "Rourke isn't burning you out for grazing land. The soil here is too rocky, the water too deep. He's spending more on hired guns than the cattle are worth. That's bad business. Unless the land is worth something else," Sarah finished. "Exactly. Men like Rourke don't gamble. They invest." Silas stood up, sliding the Winchester into its scabbard. "Tonight we aren't sleeping. Rourke's foreman Bull meets the mail stage every Tuesday night at the crossroads near Sweetwater Creek. He picks up Rourke's private correspondence. We're going to intercept him." Sarah poured the molten lead, the hiss of the metal filling the silence. "I'm coming with you." Silas started to shake his head. "Sarah, if I stay here," she interrupted, turning to face him with the ladle still in her hand. "I'm a sitting duck, and Lily comes too. We wrap her up, hide her in the brush near the ambush point. I am not leaving her side." Silas looked at the fierce set of her jaw. He saw the transformation. The widow was gone. The warrior had arrived. He nodded once. "Wear your darkest coat, and bring the shotgun." The ambush was set at a narrow choke point where the stage road dipped into a dry creek bed. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds, plunging the valley into a suffocating darkness. It was freezing 10 degrees below zero, but adrenaline kept the cold at bay. They hid the wagon in a thicket of scrub oak. Lily was asleep in the back, buried under 3 buffalo hides. Sarah lay prone on a ridge, overlooking the road, the double-barreled shotgun pressed against her shoulder. Silas was down in the creek bed, a shadow among shadows. At midnight, the sound of hooves echoed off the canyon walls. Bull was riding alone, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He was humming a bawdy tune, confident in his master's power, oblivious to the eyes watching him. When he entered the creek bed, Silas moved. He didn't shoot. He rose from the brush like a phantom swinging the stock of his rifle. Thwack! The blow connected with Bull's chest, knocking the wind out of him and sending him flying from the saddle. Bull hit the frozen mud hard. Before he could draw his weapon, Silas's boot was on his wrist, pinning it to the ground. The click of the Colt's hammer being cocked was loud in the stillness. "Don't breathe too loud," Silas whispered, "or it'll be your last." Sarah slid down the embankment, the shotgun trained on Bull's face. She reached into his saddlebags and pulled out the leather satchel. "What is this?" Bull wheezed, blood trickling from his lip. "You're dead, Mercer. Rourke will skin you alive." "He can try," Silas said. He looked at Sarah. "Open it." Sarah tore open the wax seal on a thick envelope. Her hands shook not from cold, but from anticipation. She pulled out a sheaf of documents. They were blueprints, maps, and a letter from the governor's office. She scanned the text, her eyes widening. "Silas," she breathed. "It's the railroad." Silas kept his gun on Bull, but looked at her. "The Union Pacific." "A spur line," Sarah said, reading rapidly. "They want to connect the silver mines in Montana to the main line in Cheyenne. The survey says the only viable pass through the mountains is Miller's Gap." She looked up, fury and realization warring in her eyes. "My land. The pass runs right through the north pasture. If the railroad comes through, they have to pay a toll, or buy the right-of-way." "How much?" Silas asked. $10,000, Sarah whispered. "Maybe 20. Rourke isn't trying to buy a ranch for 200. He's trying to steal a fortune." Silas looked down at Bull. The foreman was grinning through his bloody teeth. "You can't stop it," Bull spat. "The deal is signed. The bank foreclosure goes through on Friday. Once Rourke has the deed, he sells to the railroad on Monday." "Friday," Sarah said. "That's 2 days." Silas leaned down his face, inches from Bull's. "You're going to send a message to Rourke for me?" "Yeah," Bull sneered. "What's the message?" Silas pistol-whipped him a sharp, controlled blow to the temple that knocked the man unconscious instantly. "The message is, 'Silence,'" Silas muttered. He stood up. "Leave him. Let him walk back. By the time he wakes up, we'll be gone." They rode back to the ranch in a mixture of triumph and terror. They had the leverage, but the clock was ticking faster than ever. Back in the cabin, they secured the windows again. Lily was put back to bed. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Sarah sat at the table, the railroad maps spread out before her. "We have to go to the land office in Cheyenne," she said. "If I file this survey myself, Rourke is cut out. The railroad will deal with me directly." "Cheyenne is a 3-day ride," Silas said, pouring 2 cups of black coffee. "We don't have 3 days." "Then we wire the head office," Sarah said, "from Silver Creek." "The telegraph operator is Rourke's cousin," Silas reminded her. "He'll never send it." Sarah put her head in her hands. "Everywhere we turn, he owns the door." Silas walked around the table and stood behind her. He hesitated, then placed his hands on her shoulders. The heat of his palms seeped through her wool dress. "There is a way," Silas said softly. "But it's dangerous." Sarah turned in her chair, looking up at him. The lantern light softened the harsh lines of his face. For the first time, she didn't see the killer. She saw the man who had ridden into hell for her horses, the man who was currently stroking her shoulder with a thumb that was rough like sandpaper, but gentle as a breeze. "Tell me," she whispered. "We split up," Silas said. "I ride to the junction to tap the telegraph line directly. I have the kit in my saddlebags. I can send the message without going through town. You take Lily and hide in the old mining caves up the ridge. Rourke won't look for you there." "No," Sarah said, standing up. She was close to him now. Too close. "I'm not leaving you to do this alone. If they catch you on the line, they won't catch me," Silas said, his voice dropping to a murmur. He looked at her lips. "I've got a reason to come back now." The air between them crackled. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was a desperate, fiery attraction, born of survival. Sarah reached out her hand, touching the bandage on his cheek. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this, Silas? It's not just the debt to Jacob. You could have ridden on. You could be halfway to California." "I was a ghost, Sarah," Silas said, his voice ragged, "walking through life without touching anything. Cold. Dead. Then I knocked on your door. And you." He swallowed hard. "You opened it. You gave me a reason to be a man again." Sarah didn't think. She surged forward, her hands gripping the lapels of his duster. She pulled him down, and he met her halfway. The kiss was hard, tasting of coffee and desperation. It wasn't a gentle, courting kiss. It was a collision. Silas's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him, lifting her slightly off the floor. Sarah buried her hands in his hair, pulling him closer, trying to fuse her soul with his. For a moment, the wind outside roared the railroad. It all vanished. There was only the heat of his body and the beat of his heart against hers. They broke apart, breathless foreheads resting against each other. "Come back," Sarah commanded, her voice fierce. "You send that wire, and you come back to me." "I promise," Silas breathed. He pulled away, grabbing his gear. He looked at her one last time, a look that memorized her face and then slipped out into the night. Sarah touched her lips, still burning. She turned to the maps. She had to believe. She had to hold the line. The morning sun brought a blinding glare, offering no warmth. Sarah had hidden Lily in the caves as planned, leaving the child with the shotgun and a desperate lie that Silas would return. Back at the ranch, Sarah staged a diversion smoke from the chimney, a dummy in the rocking chair, hoping to buy Silas time to reach the telegraph junction 10 miles east. She waited. The hours ticked by, like water dripping from a faucet. At 2 o'clock, a rider finally appeared on the ridge. It wasn't Silas. It was Sheriff Grady, waving a white flag. He pulled up to the porch, looking pale and sick, and produced a battered black Stetson from his saddlebag. Silas's hat. "He's alive," Grady stammered as Sarah leveled her rifle at him. "But barely. Rourke caught him at the junction. It was a setup." Sarah felt the world tilt. "You're lying. Rourke wants a trade," Grady continued, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "The deed and the railroad maps for the man's life. He's hanging him at sunset, Sarah. He's pinning the barn fire on him to rile up the town." "He'll kill us both if I go," Sarah whispered, gripping the Winchester white-knuckled. "Likely," Grady admitted. "But there's worse. Rourke's men found the camp, Sarah. They know the girl is out there." The blood turned to ice in Sarah's veins. The trap was perfect. If she went to town to save Silas, Rourke's men would find Lily. If she went to Lily, Silas would hang, and Rourke would win. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I can't watch a lynching," Grady said, his voice trembling. "And the cavalry is in town. Major Sullivan. If you can get to the major with those papers." He looked toward the hills, making a decision that would cost him his career, but save his soul. "I can't stop Rourke, but I can get the girl. I promise, Sarah. I'll take her to the church." It was a devil's gamble, but it was the only card she had left. "If she is harmed, Grady, I will hunt you to the gates of hell." "Go!" he yelled. Sarah rode Bess into the ground, galloping toward Silver Creek, not to negotiate, but to war. The town was buzzing with morbid excitement. A gallows stood before the livery stable. In the center of the chaos, Silas Mercer sat on a horse, a noose around his neck. He was beaten bad, one eye swollen shut, blood dripping onto his duster, but he sat upright, unbowed. Rourke stood nearby, shouting to the crowd about justice for the sawmill fire. "Let him go." The voice cracked like a whip. Sarah Miller rode down the main street, reins in her teeth, the rolled-up maps in one hand and her rifle in the other. The crowd parted, terrified by her ferocity. "The grieving widow," Rourke sneered. "Just in time." "I'm here to show the truth," Sarah shouted, holding up the documents. "This man is innocent, Warrensenians, who is lying. These are railroad surveys. He killed my husband and burned my barn to steal the right-of-way for the Union Pacific," the crowd murmured. Rourke's face darkened. "She's mad, seize her. I wouldn't do that." The saloon doors swung open. Major Sullivan stepped out, flanked by 12 cavalry troopers with carbines raised. "Hanging a man without trial is a federal crime, Mr. Rourke." Sullivan caught the papers Sarah threw to him. He scanned the map. "Arrest him." Cornered and desperate, Rourke screamed. He raised his revolver not at the soldiers but at Silas. If he was going down, He was taking the drifter with him. Bang! The shot didn't come from Rourke. Sarah hadn't lowered her rifle. From the back of her horse, she fired. The bullet struck Rourke in the shoulder, spinning him into the mud. Troopers swarmed the scene. Sarah slid from her horse and ran to Silas as the rope was cut. They crumbled to the ground together, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. "You came." Silas rasped his head in her lap. "I told you not to." "I never listen," Sarah sobbed, pressing her forehead against his bloody cheek. "Lily?" Silas asked, panic flaring in his good eye. "Grady has her," Sarah whispered. "She's safe. It's over, Silas. It's finally over." The gunshot didn't just end the standoff. It shattered the fear that had held Silver Creek hostage. Rourke lay writhing in the mud, his shoulder shattered by Sarah's aim. Major Sullivan wasted no time ordering his troopers to haul the screaming tyrant away in irons. The town, paralyzed for so long, finally exhaled. But Sarah didn't watch the tyrant fall. She was on her knees in the muck, clutching Silas. "Get a doctor!" she screamed, her voice raw. They carried Silas to the clinic like a fallen king. As Dr. Aris worked to staunch the bleeding, the door creaked open. Sheriff Grady walked in, looking tired and aged. In his arms was Lily. The sheriff placed his badge on the table, a final act of resignation and redemption. "She's safe," Grady said softly. "Brave as a lion, that one." "One?" Sarah wept, pulling the child into her arms. Grady left without another word, riding out of a town he had failed, leaving behind the only decent thing he had done in years. The weeks that followed were a blur of fever and ice. They moved Silas back to the ranch where the winter snows trapped them in a cocoon of healing. Sarah became the nurse and the rancher chopping ice from the trough and spoon-feeding Silas broth. Lily became the glue reading to the bedridden gunman from an old Bible. In the quiet of the snowbound cabin, the lines between debtor and creditor, widow and drifter dissolved. They became a family. One evening as the wind howled, Silas tried to sit up. "The snow is melting," he murmured, his grey eyes clear for the first time in weeks. "Roads will be clear soon. I should go." "Go where?" Sarah asked, her heart hammering. "I'm a gunman with a prison record," Silas said, looking at his scarred hands. "I have nothing to offer a woman like you. I was supposed to save you, Sarah, not the other way around." "We saved each other," Sarah said fiercely, taking his hand. "I don't care about your past. I care about who stands beside me when the fire comes. Don't run, Silas. Stay." Silas pulled her hand to his lips. "I'm done running," he promised. Spring arrived with a violence of mud and green grass, and with it came the suits from the Union Pacific. Mr. Thorne, a man with a pinched face, sat at Sarah's kitchen table. $500, Thorne offered, for the right-of-way. Sarah didn't blink. She sat at the head of the table with Silas, standing behind her, a silent, looming sentinel. 15,000, Sarah counted. And a depot for Silver Creek. Thorne choked. "That's extortion. That's business." Silas rumbled his voice, dark and dangerous. "Miller's Gap is the only route. Sign the check or explain to your shareholders why the line is delayed." Thorne signed. Sarah held the draft enough to rebuild the barn, restock the herd, and secure a future for Lily. Later that afternoon, Silas walked alone to the hill overlooking the ranch. He stood before the simple wooden cross Jacob Miller. He took off his hat, the spring breeze catching his hair. "I didn't save you, Jake," Silas whispered to the earth. "I carry that every day. But I kept the promise. And I fell in love with her. I'll raise the girl like my own, and I'll build this place into something you'd be proud of." He poured a splash of whiskey on the grave. "Rest easy, Ghost. I have the watch now." Silas turned back toward the cabin. Down in the valley, smoke rose from the chimney. Sarah and Lily were in the yard waving to him. Silas Mercer, the lonely rancher, who had knocked on a door in a storm, raised his hand in return. He walked down the hill, leaving the shadows of the past behind, stepping into the golden light of a life he had finally earned. And so the story of Sarah Miller and Silas Mercer reminds us that even in the harshest winters, when the wolves are at the door, hope can still knock. They found love not in the easy times, but in the fire of adversity, proving that family isn't just blood, it's who stands beside you when the world tries to burn you down. If this story of justice, romance, and the wild frontier moved you, please take a second to hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. Don't forget to share this with a friend who loves a good Western drama, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next adventure. Thanks for watching.